Okay, hello everyone, thank you. Thank you for coming. So we're just about to get started. So welcome to this event, this circus-sponsored event, Graham Coreil-Allen, Making Place Happen. So I'm Lynn Kazaman. I'm the director of the Center for Innovation, Research, and Creativity in the Arts here at UMBC. I'm also a professor in the Visual Arts Department. Before we begin, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that UMBC was founded on the unceded tribal lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to mention another upcoming event that Circa is sponsoring. It's called Legacies. It's a panel discussion celebrating the life and work of Maurice Berger and also the work of Fred Wilson. And it's going to be a panel discussion with Fred Wilson. If you know who he is, he's actually a very well-known artist, so it's really great that he's going to be on campus. As well as curator George Sissel, who will be moderating the discussion with Fred, and our local artists Ashley Minner, Chris Kojar, as well as UMBC's Lee Boot and Sims Gardner. So that'll be on April 19th at 6:30 in the Fine Arts Recital Hall. If you go to circa.umbc.edu, you can register to attend. It will also be streamed on YouTube, that event, if all goes well with technology. Please, I'd like to introduce our guest, Graham Coreil-Allen. I've admired his work for many years. I'm really happy that he was able to come to speak. So Graham is a Baltimore-based public artist, making places more inclusive and livable through public art, placemaking, and civic engagement. So Graham was born in Galveston, Texas. He grew up in Tampa, Florida. He completed his BA at New College of Florida and earned his MFA at MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art. Since founding Graham Projects in 2005, Coreil-Allen has created public projects and programs for numerous organizations, places, and events, both nationally and abroad, including Baltimore Office of Promotion of the Arts, Deitch Creative Time, Art Parade, IBEAM, the Baltimore Museum of Art, Washington Project for the Arts, the Arlington Arts Center, Artscape, the Transmodern Festival, Viz Arts, Current Space, and ICA Baltimore and Light City. Coreil-Allen's work has been featured in numerous exhibitions and media outlets, including at the American Pavilion in the 13th International Venice Architecture Biennial. He's also been featured on the podcast 99% Invisible and also in Forecast, a public art magazine. Coreil-Allen was the 2018 OSI Baltimore Community Fellow, and he served as co-chair of Baltimore City Mayor's Brandon Scott's Arts and Culture Transition Committee. So please welcome Graham Coreil-Allen.
Thank you, Lynn. I've been a great admirer of your work since I saw it in one of the Sondheim shows years ago. And thank you all, the UMBC community, as well as Circa for hosting me. Thanks, Ellen, for Kristen.
That's okay.
For passing the slides on. I love UMBC, and I've been here before. It's great to be back. So I'm a public artist, and this is my contact information. You're welcome to write it down if you can see it. I'm sorry for the contrast. Graham, like honeygram, at grahamprojects.com. And I'm also across social media at Graham Projects. Next. I was born in Galveston, Texas, but I mostly grew up in Tampa, Florida, and particularly a suburb outside of Tampa called Temple Terrace. This is the strip mall where I first got to sort of experience my bit of independence by riding my bicycle to it. This is known as Terrace Plaza. And you can see in this picture that it's pretty much all vacant, and the parking lot is being torn up. And that's because at the time it had been purchased. It was sort of going vacant, and the city, the suburb purchased it, and they were demolishing it to prepare for a redevelopment. But this was essentially kind of like what would have been our main street. And one of the things that I, years later kind of looked back fondly on is that this is actually the first work of public art that I got to experience. This was a Publix supermarket, and it had a big, beautiful hand-painted tile mural on the wall that shows orange groves, which is what used to exist before they developed the town. and a cornucopia, which is like a woven basket that's filled with all sorts of fruits and vegetables just spilling out, showing the bounty of what the land would produce and what you could then purchase at the supermarket. Next, please. And now I live here, which is awesome. So I studied a bit in New Orleans, went back to Florida, finished my BA, and then I moved to Brooklyn, and I lived there for a few years, and I was doing the whole, like, work your butt off as an artist in New York, so you can make art on the weekends. And I was really envious of some of my friends who were in Baltimore, and I would take the Chinatown bus down, from 88 Broadway to the O'Donnell Street Travel America Plaza, and then I would ride my bike into the city of Baltimore. And I had a couple friends that lived at the H&H building, which is right there. And I was so impressed. They were paying $375 for 1,000 square feet overlooking a beautiful skyline of downtown Baltimore. And I was like, I want that. And so I was very lucky in that I was doing this sort of conceptual art practice where I was trying to, this is up in New York, where I was trying to reveal the sort of political latent truths of public space by rearranging elements therein. And that was a form of détournement, which is a situationist concept of, like, basically, rearranging existing things to reveal something. And the Situationists were a revolutionary sort of student-led group from the 1960s that most famously participated in, like, the Paris Commune of '68. What I really liked here is that in Baltimore, I was getting the sense that there was a lot of really cool DIY culture taking place, and there was really no pretense. There was no condescension or anything. I decided, I was like, well, if I'm going to work a bunch, I might as well do it somewhat in the art sector, so I probably need a master's degree in art. So I thought I would get an MFA, and originally I was just going to apply to a few schools, and then one of my former mentors said, you should apply to all the schools. So I applied to 12 schools, and I got into 1.5 schools, all right? And one of them was MICA, and the other one was, I say half, because it was a post-bac at School of the Art Institute, Chicago. And I was thinking, like, I don't know if I really could afford a post-bac at this point, but MICA did have a scholarship, so I accepted that, and I went to Mount Royal College of Art. And Baltimore has really treated me well. But in the years since I moved here in 2008, I've come to understand that so much of what makes it possible for me to be a successful artist is really based on a lot of privilege. And so this is a disclosure. Obviously, I'm a very privileged guy. I'm a white dude. I come from a middle-class background. I have an education. I'm able-bodied, etc. The fact that we have cheap rents in central Baltimore has everything to do with the historically racist policies of subsidizing white flight out to the suburbs, which vanquished a lot of the middle class in the city, and then further inhibiting the growth of the black middle class through redlining, thereby dispossessing black families of their properties or just making it impossible for them to successfully purchase this stuff. And then we have these rundown neighborhoods, and you have this sort of romantic narrative, like artists moving back into, like, busted neighborhoods and fixing them up or whatever, but we have to understand that there's a much bigger political process at play there, and acknowledge how even in this situation, I continue to benefit from historical racism. So next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, I run, my practice is called Graham Projects, and it is a Baltimore-based creative agency making cities more inclusive and livable through public art, placemaking, and civic engagement for pedestrian safety and play. And I like to show the team that I work with. I work with a very big team. I'm constantly collaborating with people. I have a whole roster of freelance artist assistants that I work with, contractors, fabricators, engineers, you name it. But these are my two primary folks I work with. That's Melvin Jadaling, and he's our Director of Operations and Engagement. And this is Zoe Roan Hopkins. She's a landscape designer and also kind of very much into public art and placemaking. So next slide, please. However, I do, since this isn't, I imagine, raise your hand if you're in an art program here, I'm just curious. Okay, cool, we got a lot of folks in art programs. And so I have organized my practice as an artist as a business. My business is called Graham Projects. Its legal name is Graham Projects LLC. As a public artist, organizing my practice as such allows me to protect my personal assets. That's the limited liability part. Purchase materials wholesale, collaborate with other types of organizations and entities, and bid on public projects. And so I learned that while at first it sort of felt a little kitschy to be like, I'm going to be a business, I was like, no, wait, I'm going to be a business. I'm going to do this for real. I want to make a living off of this and really leverage the tools at hand to try to truly affect change. And we do live in a capitalist society. I am, for the most part, an anti-capitalist. However, I try to still achieve, inclusionary goals through what tools that I have at my disposal. It says I founded Grant Projects in 2005. That was when I registered the website, and I'm very proud of that. I have this website for a long time. I formed the LLC in 2016, and at that point in time, I was working half-time at Johns Hopkins, and I was also kind of sort of covering the rest of my expenses with grants and other types of freelance art and design projects. It got so busy at a certain point that something had to give, and I didn't want it to give up on the art. So I looked at my figures, and I was like, all right, with my monthly expenses, I have enough money saved in the bank, I can last 5 months, right? And I quit my job, I could last 5 more months. And so I quit my job at Johns Hopkins in 2016, and that 5 months kept on sort of moving, that target kept on moving, and I kept on getting new projects. And so I'm very thankful and appreciative that I have the opportunity to continue to make work in Baltimore City and beyond, thereby sustaining not only me, but also the other folks that I've mentioned earlier. Next, please. I'm just sharing with you a little bit of this is kind of how I pitch our company to the outside world, let's say. You present the place challenge, grant projects and stakeholders like your community, envision creative solutions, you approve a design, and when I'm saying you, I'm talking about typically the client here, which is for the most part, community organizations, community development corporations, nonprofits, entities like this, and together we make place happen, which is the name of this talk. Next, please. So I'm going to start a little bit ways back, walks and talks for a good chunk of my time here in Baltimore. Basically 2012 through 2018, I was doing a lot of walking tours as a part of my work as a social practice artist. Next, please. And I call these walking tours new public sites, which creatively explore the history, design, and uses of the invisible sites and overlooked features of our everyday environment. Next, please. So all too often, public spaces may be invisible because they appear to be vacant, right? But nothing is ever truly vacant. Vacancy is really all about not looking in creative ways or not listening to the right voices, let's say. Nothing is ever vacant. And so earlier I showed you a picture of that strip mall in Tampa. This is what the strip mall looked like for many years afterwards. They demolished it. The city built literally a main street. They had a developer from Georgia lined up who said they were going to build a traditional main street with, shops on the ground floor and offices and things like this. So the town assembled the site, tore down the buildings, constructed the main street with the beautiful ADA accessible crosswalk. You got the detectable warning surface here for people with vision impairments. And then 2008 happened, and so we had the Great Recession, and the developer from Georgia bailed and said, we're not going to build this. And so this town of Temple Terrace was left with a main street and nothing around it. So this vacancy actually tells a lot about, the vulnerabilities of a city that was trying to once again find its identity through redevelopment. Next slide, please. This is, public spaces may also seem invisible or overlooked because they lack the formal architectural framing and legibility. And when I say legibility, I mean you kind of look at it or you feel it, you experience it, and you're like, yeah, this is a public space, right? And that might exist as formally paved streets, parks, and plazas with a sign and some bushes or landscaping things that sort of say this is the town square, right? But this is also a public space. It doesn't have any of that. This is a parkland. This is actually recreational space underneath 395 and 95 in the middle branch of downtown Baltimore. And here we are following a sun path, which is that beam of light cast down between the shadows of two overpasses. And as we walked towards the middle branch of the Inner Harbor, we discovered deer tracks in the mud. And I thought that was so beautiful and poetic to imagine how even in the midst of this post-industrial landscape, we had immense wildlife. Next slide, please. In addition, we also, in my tours, I really wanted to highlight the political geography of place and how people, despite things like the Highway to Nowhere, which was a proposed east-west highway from the 1960s that would have blasted all the way across Baltimore. They built one segment of it in West Baltimore, about 11 blocks long. They demolished 10,000 structures, displaced over 1,000 people, numerous schools and churches. And the reason why this happened is because they targeted the black neighborhood first, which was the most politically vulnerable. And as this section of the Highway to Nowhere was being constructed in West Baltimore, neighborhoods further out east and west that were not as black were able to successfully mobilize their political forces to stop the highway going through Lincoln Park and to stop the highway going through Fells Point. And so therefore, the highway, what was meant to be I-70 and was now Route 40, was left with this one segment, this orphaned segment, this highway to nowhere. And despite that tragic story, what I think is really beautiful and yet humble is this monument to the connectivity of neighborhood, that even despite that highway, residents in West Baltimore continue to walk back and forth across it, creating a desire line, which is a path developed by pedestrian footfall erosion, marking the shortest and most easily navigable route between origin and destination. And so along my new public sites walking tours, I really got into sort of the poetry of place and learning these terms or making up terms altogether, or maybe hearing something from another participant and thinking like, yeah, that's like a great way to kind of like characterize this place, because ultimately it's hard to understand public spaces or anything for that matter if we don't have some sort of shared terminology. And so for me as an artist, it was mixing in a sense of artistry through the language writing itself, a bit of the performance, but also really through creating these situationists, once again going back to the Situationists International, and how is it that we can create an experience, even if it's just a moment in time where we learn from each other in different ways. Next slide, please. And in doing so, I've been invited out to places like Denver, where I worked with Redline Contemporary Arts Center on leading a tour here in the surrounding sort of Rhino District area, and here we are listening to one of the local residents who's talking about her job as a Title VI coordinator for the Mass Transit Agency. So she both is from this neighborhood and talking about how her job is to basically make sure that all the transit projects are benefiting neighborhoods equitably. So ensuring that people of all races and dispositions are benefiting from the transit investments that are being made. Next slide, please. And here we have a few other sample slides of, this is a really fun tour that I did in 2018. It was called Auchentrolley by Foot. So I live on Auchentrolley Terrace, which is a big highway on the west side of Druid Hill Park. And these are all my neighbors. And sort of like a fundraising thing, I partnered with Baltimore Heritage, which is a preservation organization that I sit on the board of. And we did a historical walking tour. I don't always advertise my tours as like necessarily historical, but in this case we did. And we charged admission for outsiders, for visitors to come and pay money. That money both benefited the neighborhoods and Baltimore Heritage. And then of course all residents were invited, and we got to listen to all these amazing leaders of the era, including Ms. Sandra Allman Cooper, who was the long-term president of the Mondawmin Neighborhood Improvement Association. And she's actually standing in front of a little two-story row house on Liberty Heights Avenue that was once home to Verda Welcome. Verda Welcome was the first black female state legislator in the country. She was elected in I think in like 1962 or so, survived an assassination attempt and continued to serve for many years after that, and had a profound impact on West Baltimore. That's my other former neighborhood president, Miss Barbara Anderson Dandy. I didn't realize it, but when I was moving to 3200 block of Auchentrolley, I was 2 houses down from Miss Barbara, and she really got me involved and showed me the ropes. And then here we have the mayor of Greater Mondawmin, Mr. Nathaniel Freeman, who was actually, in returning from World War II from the Air Force, was one of the handful of black folks in the community that did get a GI Bill and was able to purchase his home in 1958 for like an absurdly low amount of money. He teased me about it one time and said, "How much do you think I got this house for in 1958? And I was like, "I don't know, $5,000. He was like, "Try $500. It was wild. He's been there ever since, and his son is Lauren Cornish, who's a very famous mosaic artist based in Baltimore and is in collections all around the world. Next slide, please. So kind of, I did a lot of walking tours. I still do walking tours as a part of participatory planning processes, but I don't do these so much as like a publicly scheduled thing anymore. Next slide, please. But I did want to talk a little bit more about this highway that I live on. So this is what the west side of Druid Hill Park used to look like. This is Auchentrolley Terrace. This is the first set of aerial photos taken in 1927. And you can see, I just want to point out here, every single side street turns into a pathway into Druid Hill Park. That's a 2-lane residential street. Every single side street turns into a pathway for walking. And next slide, please. And this is what it looked like overall. And so you can see that's Druid Hill Park. There's the lake. There's the former Circle Reservoir up at the top, but you can see how there's all these corners. The park really integrates intimately into the surrounding neighborhoods. Same as Druid Park Lake Drive, Reservoir Hill area. That was also a 2-lane residential street. Next slide, please. And this is where I live, and you can just kind of see now what it looks like. We have this big fat highway that kind of goes through here. And so between the 1940s and the 1960s, that 2-lane residential street was widened into a roaring 8 to 10 lane highway, right? And that, once again, was actually one of the first highway projects in Baltimore City. It's the second oldest one after the Harbor Tunnel Thruway. And this was done over the protest of what was then a predominantly Jewish and black neighborhood. It so happened that at the time when this highway widening project from the residential street into this big highway, was being proposed, it was really being pushed by a guy named Jack Pollock, who was one of the political honchos of the day. He ran the Trenton Democratic Club, and back then there were these like political clubs that would essentially like pick who was going to be the next council person, let's say. And then so behind the scenes, this is not very democratic. There would be some discussions, and the political boss would decide, and then he would use his campaigning machine to get a bunch of people to vote for his slate of candidates. And it so happened that Jack Pollock lived right up Reisterstown Road on Anoka Avenue. That highway literally ended right on his street. So he literally kind of proposed a highway going to his house. And when it was voted on by the Planning Commission, there was only one dissenting vote. That happened to be the only African American on the Planning Commission back in the 1940s. So that does say a lot. The NAACP was against it, and that was disregarded. And the highways were constructed. Next slide, please. And we can kind of see, some of the consequences of that. We went from having approximately 24 entrances, historical entrances to the park. And by that I mean like where a street turns into a sidewalk. That's an entrance, right? Where you can take a sidewalk into a park. And now we're down to 8. We're down to 8 entrances. Next slide, please. And just to kind of show you some of the demographics of the area, the most semi-recent demographics is you can see it's a very, all around the park, zip code 21217, racial composition, overwhelmingly African-American, very high population density relative to basically double the rest of the city, lower median household income, high poverty level, 20% vacant. And I think this is the most telling is actually basically over 50% of residents in this area of West Baltimore do not drive. And so they get a ride from their friend, carpooling. Mostly they take, my neighbors take the bus or the subway, walk, bicycling, and so on. And yet our roads are over like 90% dedicated to private motor vehicles. And so that's not fair. Next slide, please. And these are some of the consequences, in terms of, people who might want to walk across the street where there's no longer that sidewalk or that crosswalk anymore. Instead, we face 8 lanes of traffic, 143-foot crossing distance. And then, kids who are on like scooters and bikes and stuff, they're trying to go to the playground, one of the 2 playgrounds in the area that's in the park. And at this is at Fulton Avenue, they have to cross 10 lanes of traffic. Next slide, please. And this is kind of like, what it is that folks really enjoy in the park. This is just one example of the many amazing things that happen in Druid Hill Park. This is Druid Hill Park's farmer's market, right? It's awesome. Fresh food, entertainment, prepared dishes, cultural gathering, right? Next slide, please. So seeing these disparities of transportation access and green space access, myself and other neighbors started working with then Councilman Leon Pinka, this is back in 2016, on trying to rethink some of these roads around here. And one of the the first opportunities we saw is the city undertook a infrastructure project where they had to bury 2 big tanks to protect the drinking water in the Druid Lake. And as a consequence of that, they were going to be closing off a lane of traffic along Druid Park Lake Drive. And so we said, hey, that's a great opportunity to close off the other lane of traffic on the other side and create what became the Big Jump. The Big Jump is a shared use path that ultimately created the first connection for people to be able to accessibly walk from central Baltimore to West Baltimore in the first time in history. Before that, next slide please, they were faced with obstacles like this, cars that were running off the road, smashing into huge boulders, throwing them on the sidewalk, very poor pavement, making it very difficult for people in wheelchairs to get around. And furthermore, a pedestrian bridge that was built in 1961 that has a ledge. So this means that if you are a mobility rider of any sort, you cannot use this pedestrian bridge. So literally there was no way to get to job centers like Johns Hopkins or nowadays all the development in Remington like our house and things like this. Next slide, please. And so we worked with the Department of Transportation, Bikemore, and our city councilman. They applied for a grant from People for Bikes organization, which awarded them a nice chunk of money to purchase all these big plastic water-filled barriers, which were then used to create this, what we call a shared use path. And so that's a path for walking, wheelchair riding, and bicycling. And so for the first time ever, creating that connection across the Jones Falls Highway and increasing accessibility in West Baltimore. Next slide, please. And oh yeah, can we go back actually? So what did I have to do with this? Aside from being an advocate, I did work with residents on coming up with ideas on how we might brand this or label it, and also creating these stencils. And so we did community stenciling. We went around on bike and foot and put down the stencils and sprayed them on the ground. And we also had these colorful footprints that sort of led people from the side streets into the shared use path. And so that was the idea, was to show people, hey, this is for us. Next slide. And here we are during, just like kind of everyday stuff, a guy riding to work, I think this is a nurse walking back from work. And then during the kickoff, we did another walking tour, and this is Miss D. She's a wheelchair rider. She lives in one of the big apartment towers on Druid Park Lake Drive. And here we are listening to her stories of access and how much her and her neighbors cherish the park, and how appreciative she is of having this shared use path. And I thought this was really cute. It's like for the first time, she was able to, on her own, ride her electric wheelchair across the Jones Falls Expressway to go to Burger King and get a milkshake, which is something that I love to do as well. Next slide, please. And building on that success, I had a couple of neighbors in Reservoir Hill who sort of saw my work and reached out to me and said, and so on the left there, that's Jessie DeSantis. She's a Miami-born, but Baltimore-based painter. And she had painted this beautiful rendition of the Druid Park gate at Madison Avenue, which itself is actually separated from the park now by the highway. But nevertheless, in the 1860, when this was constructed, it represented the formal entrance to Druid Hill Park. And she had painted it in this really amazing tropical style. And then her neighbor, Courtney Bettle, and her wanted to somehow translate the painting into reality. And so they wanted to do that through light art. And they had seen that I had done some light art projects, and so we brainstormed like how we could do this. We went and got a small grant. It wasn't enough to make this permanent, but it was enough to get something started. Next slide, please. And here it is. You see, we rented a bunch of a bunch of LED spotlights from an event company, and I forget how much we paid for it, but it was like in total, I think we had around $4,000 grant to organize this. So we illuminated the gateway, and we organized this parade called the Arches and Access Community Parade. Next slide, please. And here you see it. So behind the gate is the Reservoir Hill neighborhood, and in front of the gate, this is actually Druid Park Lake Drive, that big highway. And we brought in the Twilighters marching band, paid them for their performance, all sorts of puppeteers, a food truck, and had hundreds of residents come out to really celebrate in, that connection and once again create a situation. And by that I mean it's like a time-based experience. We didn't permanently change the highway at that point, but we did for a couple hours there. We owned that street, and it was really fun. I found out that we could submit an application through the Department of Transportation and request something called TEOs, traffic enforcement officers, and we paid them for their time. They're actually, all the TEOs were being used at a Ravens game because that's apparently where the city's priority lies. But we did get some sheriff TEOs, which is his own agency that predates the police. And they actually shut down the traffic for us. And so this was how we got it permitted. The sheriffs closed off Drew Park Lake Drive, and we literally just partied in the middle of the street for like 30 minutes. All the cars just piled up. And then we continued into the park. Next slide. And you can see here we are marching through the park with more illuminated pathways, and then we sort of concluded and then had an outdoor dance party at the Rawlings Conservatory, which is a really cool second oldest greenhouse in the country after San Francisco's. It's free or donation. You can go in there and check out really amazing palm trees and epiphytes and all sorts of neat stuff. And so we had some snacks and glow sticks and DJ from the community. And it was very family friendly. Like the dance party was over by 8:30, all right, which I really loved because I was kind of exhausted and it was time for me to go to bed. But this was a fun time. Next slide, please. In another instance, after this, I was invited I actually did a talk at the BMA with an artist named Peter Schwarzbein, who was a relational artist based out of El Paso, who created this fictitious campaign for a streetcar that would reconnect downtown El Paso with Juarez, Mexico. And that was his vision. So he put up these posters and he sent out a press release and briefly for a day convinced the media in El Paso that there was going to be a streetcar to Mexico. And of course that wasn't the case, but it did build a lot of enthusiasm around for an ongoing campaign to rebuild streetcars in El Paso. And he was later ran for and successfully elected as the council representative for the 1st district. So this is literally a Chicano Jewish artist from El Paso who ran for office, got office, and then was able to leverage that power to work with the other transit advocates to then get a $90 million appropriation from the state legislature to rebuild the first streetcar line. And on the eve of that streetcar opening up, he invited me to come and do a fun mapping project. Basically, he wanted this kickoff to be an opportunity for residents and businesses to think about, hey, you're about to get a streetcar stop, in your neighborhood. How would you like to take advantage of that? How would you like your neighborhood to develop? What could be added to complement and build on that infrastructure investment? And so I designed this big map in collaboration with the city and the neighborhood associations. We set it up at the El Paso Museum of Art, and it has the streetcar line on the map, and we have sort of the different, zoning uses and densities, all the streets named. And here we are gathering at the museum. Next slide, please. We all then piled on a bus that was dressed up to look like a streetcar. And that's Peter Schwarzbein, the councilman. And here he is talking on the bus, kind of giving a tour. And then we were stopping at these different future stops of the streetcar where we would hear from him and other resident leaders and business owners about, what it is like in their neighborhood at this time, what could they build on. And then we went, next slide, back to the museum and did this interactive mapping project where folks were invited to take these little laser cut signs that I created to identify the assets, challenges, and ideas that they have on the map. And so the assets were little green signs. The challenges were triangular yellow signs, sort of like a caution sign. And then we had these blue cloud signs that represented ideas, everything from the practical to the fantastical. And so everyone as young as kids were able to participate. We had Play-Doh so you could make sculptures. Next slide, please. And you can kind of see, one of the oversights that wasn't covered in the original appropriation was there was no shelter. It's El Paso. And so people were like, shade, we need something pretty practical here. It's going to be very hot. But other ideas was hey, we have this streetcar route. Let's make that a heritage tour. They didn't have a regular heritage tour in El Paso. And so that was a really cool idea that came out of there. And then, somebody took tape and sort of hatched over the highway and we're like, let's cover the highway and build a park. Next slide, please. Oh wait, go back, I'm sorry. And I wanted to point out here, this is proposed, Peter's saying, okay, phase 2, we're actually going to Juarez, right? That was the idea because there actually was a streetcar between El Paso and Juarez up until 1974. Next slide, please. And here we are at the end of one of the 2 workshops that I did that weekend. With the mix of planners and participants, taking pride in their ideas, and that sort of helped to kickstart conversations around future land use adjustments. This is like really boring stuff, but it's how things happen, right? Like what needs to happen in terms of the city's actual zoning map to accommodate some of these ideas? What could the councilman do that then support existing cultural organizations like in the downtown barrio, you know, which is like basically it's like a straight up Mexican neighborhood. You know, you don't really even hardly hear English there. You know, to support the historical heritage of that area. Next slide. And so in addition to the walks and kind of the planning concepts, you know, interactive planning, I like to build things. And so streets for people, let's do it. So this was my first piece that I got a little notoriety for. 2013, this Baltimore Office of Promotion of the Arts put out a call for proposals for artistic crosswalks in the Bromo district, which is on the west side of downtown. I had this idea of doing hopscotch, like sort of direct action hopscotch boards where I'd put tape on the ground and create a hopscotch board in a place where I thought it might be fun. I did that a few times in Florida and New York. And I thought, I wonder if we could get away with doing that in Crosswalk. And so I proposed that. And here we have the Hopscotch Crosswalk Colossus, which we're now witnessing a businessman walking on his way to work early one morning. And this is the hopscotch for him because it shows just like regular shoe prints, and that's to represent the business people. And if you follow it that direction, you do end up in the central business district. And for those of you who might be sort of like photo majors or whatever, you will recognize this. The gentleman's shoe is floating about 3 inches off the ground. That's known as the decisive moment. I was very lucky to get that picture, and so I love to show it. Next slide, please. And here you see it from the 14th or 15th floor of the Bromo Seltzer Tower. And so in addition to the shoe prints, we've got the bare feet prints, which if you follow those, you end up back at like, you know, the warehouse buildings like the H&H. So that loosely represents, you know, sort of like hippie artists bouncing with abandon towards their downtown loft digs. And then we've got bird tracks, which I actually took an Orioles track and a Ravens track and I tried to mash them up and came up with this. So if you follow that, you do end up on the Ravens Walk. You get down, you go through Camden Yards, and then you end up down M&T Bank Stadium. And then lastly, up on the top, we have the boot prints, which represent the history of organized labor, which is very robust in that former manufacturing district, as well as the history of active organized labor in terms of the service industries around, you know, like the medical arts that are taking place around University of Maryland's Baltimore campus. Next slide, please. And around this, a few years later, this is 2018, I collaborated with Becky Borland, who's another amazing Baltimore-based public artist who I actually know from Florida originally. And this was during Artscape. So Artscape oftentimes put out, the Baltimore Office of Promotion and the Arts will put out these call for proposals. And this is how I was able to kind of like step up from, you know, doing more programmatic work into built things. And that was through temporary projects, you know, sort of smaller budget. This was a $10,000 project. So we got a $10,000 budget. We pitched Choose Your Own Adventure, which was, the idea of which was to transform the Charles Street Bridge next to Penn Station into this playful environment. And we did that on the cheap by renting an existing metal tent structure. We said, we want the tent structure, but not the tent. We just want the structure because we want to build something that's going to be durable from which we can then hang 450 inflatable beach balls. And these beach balls are translucent, and on them we had a muralist, Greg Gannon, paint these different sort of absurdist phrases. These were sort of like invitations for people to go out and experience the city in unusual ways, like write a poem in the dirt. Next slide, please. And here we can watch a video, see what this is like. And we were very lucky because there was a DJ that set up right here, and they were playing music the whole time. So in addition to creating this street mural on the ground that visually sort of pulled people into the pavilion, then you would hear music and see this environment that totally became like a selfie spot for that year's Artscape. Students were coming through early in the morning on field trips. Everyone wanted to come up and touch the art, which is very much encouraged. Stand on the Howard Street Bridge, sing along with the roar of traffic. All right, next slide, please. Okay. If you go to my website, grandprojects.com, and you click on projects, you can watch this whole video and many others. Also around the same time, I was invited to create another artistic crosswalk by the Friends of Margaret Brent, which is a parent-led sort of auxiliary group for Margaret Brent Elementary, which is on 26th Street. And to get student ideas for artwork to serve as an art crosswalk, and to explain the concept of traffic calming, which was really the big concern here, I was invited to the field day to do a workshop. And so what the parents were concerned about is the difficulty that kids were experiencing walking across the street with the fast cars on St. Paul and Calvert. And so we did a drawing workshop where I kind of talked about the idea of like, what is a crosswalk, how does it work, how could we potentially make it safer, and then with the trust being established by the art teacher at the time, we were able to have these discussions and also learn about what it was the kids were studying in school. This is also an arts-focused elementary school. And so they kind of just showed, some of the things they were reading, different types of, like microphone for one girl who was all about singing, and other ideas, from which I then used as inspiration to develop 3 crosswalk designs. These were shared both at the school and at community meetings for people to vote on. Next slide, please. And then we went out and created an artistic crosswalk. At the same time, this section of 26th Street had collapsed and started to collapse into an adjacent train track. And so I was able to work with the Charles Village Civic Association to further advocate not just for art crosswalks, but also for pretty substantial investment of widening the sidewalks themselves to really shorten the crosswalk distance and slow down speeding cars. And so then we use those widened sidewalks as our canvas. And so this is a community paint day. I'm working with some micrograd students. There's a sorority from Johns Hopkins. There's kids from the neighborhood and so on. Next slide. And this is what it looked like before. So you can see we kind of had these this is Calvert Street. This is like deteriorated crosswalks, totally erased, cars going really fast, scary. Next slide, please. And this is what it looked like after. So this was the advertisement for this talk. So here you have it. And so what happened was, the city widened the sidewalk. And this was upon our proposal. We said, could you do something that's known as a bump out, which is where you bump out the width of the sidewalk. You still have the 2 car lanes, but instead of them having all this width, now they're kind of narrowed down. And as a driver, you feel less inclined to go fast if you're going through a more narrow space. And the effect has been profound. Next slide. This is what it looks like in person. It's a much more intimate intersection now. And we have some of these, music, drawing, flowers, hearts. There's always flowers and hearts. And that was all based off of the, the community's ideas. Next slide, please. And here you can see, the crossing guard who definitely made it clear that she loved the work. And students and their parents leaving school on this newly narrowed crosswalk, very safe, only 20 feet to cross instead of 40 feet, at which you might be a danger of being struck by a car. Next slide. More recently, I did this project. I was an architect out of Pittsburgh was working on a design for a community center. From the Bible Center Church, which is sort of it is a church, it is also a community development corporation, and so it's a nonprofit that works on helping to rebuild a historically disinvested black neighborhood known as Homewood in Pittsburgh. And they were creating this center that was going to have after-school care, as well as a after-school care, as well as a space for their church gatherings, as well as a community kitchen. So that would be like a commercial grade kitchen where catering businesses could start up and work out of the kitchen for a low cost. But they had this alleyway that they wanted to refurbish as a part of the project. And so I always look for opportunities to collaborate, and there's a muralist who I greatly admire named Ianji Ranjamandroso, who is originally from Madagascar and lived and worked in Baltimore for a long time. He's done some really incredible murals. If you've ever been on West North Avenue, you see the Wall of Wisdom next to Kappa, and that was Ianji's work. Breathtaking, gorgeous stuff. And I always wanted to work with him. And I said, Ianji, do you want to do something in Pittsburgh? And he was like, yeah, let's do it. He's based out of Las Vegas now. Next slide, please. And so we met with virtually with the pastors of the church and stakeholders, the architect, That's Alicia Volsi, the architect, and this is another local artist that she connected us with who had done a mural nearby. And we kind of came up with some design ideas, shared a few options. They liked 2 of them, so we merged them together into the Sow to Harvest trail. And so this is a walking trail that includes different sort of games like hopscotch and balance beam, as well as different traditional vegetables that are grown as a part of the food culture around there, and that is celebrated and practiced in the adjacent community kitchen. So this was us during install. That's me and Yanji, and we invited the pastors to come participate, and we had 2 other local artists who were also getting paid, living wages to help out. Next slide, please. And here you can see it on the opening day. This is the after-school program. The kids just started literally like running in down the wheelchair ramp. Next slide, please. And really just going at it, immediately kind of intuitively knowing what to do, which is always a good sign for me as a designer, seeing like, okay, we didn't have to say anything. They just like went at it. All right, next slide. And now bringing us up to more recent pandemic response. Next slide. In 2020, the Baltimore Development Corporation was able to secure some money from the federal government as a part of the CARES Act to help different Main Street organizations and neighborhoods reopen safely amidst the pandemic. So providing spaces for social distancing and the reopening of businesses. And I had already been in discussions with the Hamilton-Laurelville Main Street organization. They had wanted to do traffic calming art crosswalks. And I had developed some concepts for them, some pricing. They had been looking for a grant. And this came up, their Main Street group, and they encouraged me to put together a team. And so I teamed up with a local property owner, Property Consulting Incorporated, that owns a lot of the buildings along Harford Road, as well as local artist who literally has a studio in the upper right-hand corner, Annie Howe of Annie Howe Paper Cuts, as well as a local fabricator who lives in the next neighborhood over. That's Kyle Smith of Lanning Smith Studio. And we said, hey, we have a design build team and we want to help transform Harford Road into a place for community gathering and supporting small businesses. And this is what we created, the Curbside Commons. And so you can see here, what we actually did was, it was sort of 2 car lanes going north and basically 1 going south with a parking lane. And so we created another one of these bump outs and then established a mid-block crosswalk, which was no small feat. This is going to be kind of nerdy, but like a lot of neighborhoods have requested something called mid-block crosswalks, which is where you have like a really long block and they want some crosswalk right in the middle. And historically, the Department of Transportation in Baltimore City would be like, no, or they wouldn't even respond. But in the midst of the pandemic, we were able to make the case that like, hey, there are businesses on this side of the street, there are businesses opening up on the other side of the street. We really need a crosswalk at Rose Camp, and they approved it. And so I designed this traffic island, also known as a pedestrian refuge, put up these, cars must stop to pedestrians in the crosswalk sign, state law, and it really helped to kind of winnow down that street into something that doesn't feel so much like a thoroughfare, but maybe more like a main street. And we then took the parking lane that was on the curb and moved it over into one of the car travel lanes. So you have now 1 lane going north and 1 lane going south, kind of right-sizing that. And then we took that extra leftover space and used artwork and design to reprogram it for those Main Street type uses. Next slide, please. And you can see here, this is what it looked like before. So there's the function co-working space. Here's the new apartment building at Southern Avenue and Harford Road. There's, kind of looking down southwards to Zeke's Coffee House here, and that's Rose Camp. Next slide, please. And here's what it kind of looked like afterwards. And so this was shortly after we completed the work. They started having like a First Friday event, people gathering, selling kombucha, pizza pop-up, underground pizza having their pop-up at Zeke's, neighbors walking from around the corner to patronize businesses in the evening. And it's proven, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on this. Next slide, please. And this is going to be a future space for outdoor dining at Southern and Harford Road. Next slide, please. Okay, we can skip this. There's a video on it you can watch. There's a lot of cool drone footage. Okay, we'll have to skip that.
No. There you go.
All right, so this is the last project that I completed. And so this is called Lake to Lake. And so the Department of Transportation, and just by the way, if you haven't noticed yet, I do a lot of work with the Department of Transportation. In fact, I don't get much funding from the art world. Artist talks like this notwithstanding, thank you very much. I am able to position our company as, a partner for neighborhoods that are seeking to make their neighborhoods safer and more walkable and more wheelchair accessible. And so the Department of Transportation wrote a grant from an organization called the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is basically like the cool traffic engineers. Not like those old traffic engineers that are all about highways. We got these new traffic engineers that are all about pedestrian safety and walkability and all different uses, like not excluding cars, but just saying like, hey, let's have cars and buses and bikes and wheelchairs and walking, balance it out. So NACDO gave DOT a grant, which then they gave to Bike More, my company, and Black People Ride Bikes, which is a black bicycling club in Baltimore, to then do community engagement, to organize bike rides, and really help to invite people to share their ideas around, how is it that we might make Lake Montebello more accessible. Right now, Lake Montebello in Northeast Baltimore is also kind of surrounded by highways. It can be very difficult to reach out. So we invited people to share their ideas. Next slide, please. Through pop-ups that we did at Lake Montebello and Druid Hill Park and deep into the neighborhoods like Reservoir Hill. We had a bicycle repair pop-up where kids are riding in on their bikes, get their bikes fixed up while they're drawing ideas for artwork. And then we did a pop-up at Lake Montebello at the conclusion of the process where we got to announce the winning design. So we developed 3 design concepts, shared them out for people to vote on, and then we announced the winning design while they were there. We had all sorts of like spray chalk, temporary art stuff that people could do stencils with around the lake. That was a lot of fun. The mayor, Brandon Scott, came out, as well as various other officials, including one of the local delegates, Regina Boyce, who's great. She's super into all this type of active transportation and recreation support. And the mayor announced that the temporary ban on cars around Lake Montebello that was created during the pandemic to encourage people to really use Lake Montebello more for walking and outdoor recreation, that temporary ban on cars was now going to be permanent. And so that was one of the successes that came out of this process, is the mayor said, hey, we piloted this, people love it, we're going to keep it this way. No more cars driving around the park. Next slide. And this is what the main intersection at Hillen and 33rd used to look like. I took this drone shot. There happened to be some repair work going on in the middle of the street. You can see it's gargantuan. It's huge. It's like 6 or 7 lanes in each direction. It's a 5-way split. There's a traffic island. And it was very kind of confusing and scary if you're walking across, one of these 100-foot-long crosswalks. Next slide, please. And this is what it looked like after we completed the project. So the Department of Transportation kind of went in here and figured out, like, hey, what is the space that we don't need to leave wide open to cars? Let's make it less confusing, and let's add in some protected bike lanes as well, and add some protection to the crosswalks with like a marked median strip, and putting in little plastic posts, those are known as flex posts, to help remind cars to stay in their lane and to yield to the pedestrian space. And then within that pedestrian space, we created this artwork that's called Rheobello, which is inspired by the sunset as seen from the far east side of Lake Montebello looking west. And that was one of the common themes that we heard. People were sharing pictures of like, have you seen this sunset? I'm like, yeah, I've seen this sunset. It's a great sunset. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of like what it looks like, from a bird's eye perspective. And we have artwork that extends up onto the sidewalk. Next slide, please. And then, this was the first weekend that it was officially done. There was a walking group that was having a story sharing circle in the park. They had a lot of folks that come in through the art crosswalk. People who were cycling through, immediately taking, finding their way through that newly protected space. Folks who are on their morning power walk on Sunday morning. And so once again, seeing the intuitive use of the space shows that it is successful. There are some adjustments that are made sometimes. Like when DOT does this. They don't always get it perfect, so there's been a few adjustments made, but that's perfectly good. That's how things should happen. They should evolve. So next slide, please. And here you have it. The color's a little washed out, but I promise you, those colors up in the sky are essentially what inspired the rays of the Rheobello artwork design that we created. All right, thank you very much.
So questions? We have questions for Graham.
I have a question. Yeah. So, how do these sites, how do they get maintained? Like, is there money in this? Like, just to describe that process of like what happens after the project is over? Do you go back and revisit that type of stuff?
Sure. So they're maintained in a couple of ways. One is anytime I'm using custom colors or pigments for the special type of traffic coatings that I use, I don't use regular paint. That stuff is kind of temporary. I use a higher quality, more durable, epoxy modified coating system. I always keep extra of the colors. So if there's ever like an accident or if a utility company comes in and wants to tear up the street, I can then go back in there and repair it. But one of the essential things is that, I don't go into neighborhoods and just create a work of art, like without an invitation. And so that invitation always comes with it built in a sense of ownership and ultimately maintenance. And so there's organizations like the Hamilton-Laurelville group that are helping to maintain these spaces, doing things like sweeping up the space and just keeping an eye on it. And also the Department of Transportation, if they know that there's a utility cut happening or construction or whatever, they will tell the company that's doing that work, hey, you need to reach out to Graham Projects if you impact any of the art. You're going to have to pay them to repair it. So that's one of the ways that we go about it. The city infrastructure is on the city. So like the flex posts or striping or other features like this, if that gets demolished by a crazy car, then you can place a 311 request and contact your council person and so on, and hopefully agitate enough to get that fixed quickly.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
For the El Paso project, I know you had said that there were ideas, suggestions, and that children were involved as well in that. Was there anything that you had seen as a note in there? I know because sometimes children can be very fantastical and whimsical and just imaginary. Was there anything that you had seen on that project that really just kind of stuck in your mind as just kind of the beauty of the wonder of children? In general, just fun little suggestions or anything.
Yeah, well, I think my favorite suggestion was, there was this idea of multiple different people, like not talking, said, oh, we should have like a historical walking tour or something like this. And then, so in the facilitated discussion, like when we did it, everybody put their ideas on the map, and then we did a story circle. So we all circled up and we took turns sharing, what we shared. And so people said, this was a concern of mine, or this is an idea. And so one of the ideas that came out of that discussion that people were really jazzed about was to have, like these signs, for example, that would at each stop share something unique about the neighborhood, the history, what have you, but that they really wanted those signs to be designed by local artists. And so it kind of, I think, helped plant a seed for the next public art project that could take place in these neighborhoods that would then support local artists as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
So to follow up on the El Paso project and all your other projects, you have a lot of great activities and ways of sort of extracting and hearing from different voices who come. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways that you find most successful or most engaging to draw people in to start to engage in the first place. Like, how did you get that room of people in El Paso? Like, what do you do to because there's a selection process almost, and I'm wondering how you approach that.
Yeah, so in the example of El Paso, our project spanned 2 council districts, and so the 2 council folks put it out through their channels. So there were emails and flyers, and there was direct phone calls with community organizations and business groups, like small business associations, that were essentially encouraging them, saying like, "Hey, come out." And a lot of this, you can do a ton of marketing, right? And sometimes you don't get a good turnout. What I find as an organizer, the best turnout is through word of mouth, and so making personal invitations. So it's almost like a phone tree, old school phone tree, where if I go and I say, I know these 3 people are going to really have something to say, I can reach out to them and I say, hey, encourage, like if you know of anyone else that, would have some ideas, please invite them. And so it's kind of, as I mentioned with the 26th Street project, working through established connections of trust. So if I'm working not in my immediate community, I'm looking to the leaders of that community and saying, hey, who can you introduce me to so that they know that I'm an okay guy and they can talk with, and so that I can then hear from them and then encourage them, or maybe find out from them what's going on already. Where can we meet you at, where you are at? And so one of the things that we always search for, number one, is what are the existing festivals that are taking place or community gatherings of any sort that we can kind of jump into, so that there's already going to be a community there or communities there. And so, like, for example, the Druid Hill Farmers Market, which I showed a couple times here, happens weekly, for about half the year. And so it was a really great place for us to plug in and meet people who may not be on like the community association list, but they do come out for their fresh greens from the community garden. And so we can get input in those ways. And so for us, it's always a mix of doing in-person, flyering, always door-to-door canvassing, or not always, but like we offer various strategies. We'll say, would canvassing be helpful here? Would, engaging you at pop-ups be helpful? Would doing online tools, which we've greatly invested in since the pandemic, be helpful? And not necessarily coming in with predetermined solutions, but really asking the collaborators, the stakeholders, for them, what is, to consult their expertise. What is the best way to connect with communities? And I found, like, for example, I'm working with a neighborhood called Tawanda up in Park Heights right now. And the former neighborhood president, who's herself an artist that has brought me in to help realize a lot of with her visions collaboratively, I found that in that place it's much more intimate and much more like, hey, we're just gonna go knock on someone's door and sort of like collect a few people and then walk around and have a discussion. And so we'll do everything from very informal gatherings to much more kind of like formally facilitated Zoom with breakout rooms and blah, blah, blah. So it really kind of depends on where we're working, but we try to really listen and, as I said, design the process so that it's really specific for that community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What is the price tag on this side?
It all depends. So I would say that, so like the El Paso project I did for, I want to say $4,800. That included my travel, and designing and printing out the map and laser cutting all these little signs at OpenWorks Makerspace. But for example, like this project, this is more like a $30,000 to $40,000 project, that includes a lot more. We're looking at a lot of pavement coating product, a lot of community engagement, and I would say about two-thirds of the work that I do isn't installing the artwork, it's all the engagement and the designing work and the project management. And so that's one thing that I've really taken from my former experiences as a manager at small businesses, is having a very organized, process for keeping track of stuff and organizing everything. We really spend most of our hours on project management. That's just like permitting and communications and organizing. And then we get to build. And so like a build like this, we're probably purchasing about $8,000 worth of pavement coating products. And then, each one of these flex posts is around $75 a piece, including installation. And then maintenance of traffic starts at around $1,600 a day, and it can go higher for a much more complicated intersection like this. And so you can see how it sort of adds up quickly. But compared to construction projects, it's not a lot, So like turning this, actually widening all these sidewalks, if they were to really extend the sidewalk and not have us just fill in the existing asphalt, that would be, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So.
What's your favorite result from all those, like something that you can look back and say that was what a good project looks like, 10 years after? What would you say?
Yeah, I'm somewhat impartial. For me, it's always a process. And so when I was talking about the big jump, for example, that project of trying to make Druid Hill Park more accessible to me and my neighbors, to that vision, I've had the opportunity and privilege of creating several art projects. Temporary crosswalk, the Big Jump sort of wayfinding project, the parade. And so for me, that project is the one that is most personal to me because it's my neighborhood. And I've had the opportunity to work with like lots of different city folks and lots of other neighbors around the neighborhood. And it's certainly been the most challenging for me as well, and I've learned a lot, from my neighbors. Actually, when I first moved to West Baltimore in 2013, I didn't say anything for a long time. I literally just started going to community meetings and didn't say much. I just tried to listen. And then I started seeing commonalities in some of the things that I was very passionate about. Some of the things the neighbors have been trying to do, like slowing down cars to make it safer to walk around. And I was like, hey, maybe that's something I could help out with. But in the meantime, I built the community website. I helped out with the Facebook. I started doing kind of like little designing projects just to support what was already happening. And it was that sort of process through which I was able to connect with a lot of neighbors and people that I really care about now. And we all watch out for each other. It's like, Sesame Street or whatever. I can go into my alley and literally just like holler up at any number of people and have them at my back and vice versa. So one of the things I'm really excited about the Druid Hill Park project is actually tomorrow we are installing an art crosswalk at Fulton. I showed a picture earlier of like the little kids on bikes trying to run across 10 lanes of traffic. So we're creating artwork there tomorrow. And we're painting the sidewalks. It's a community paint day. We already have these beautiful leaves. The idea was neighbors were invited to submit leaves that they would find in the area of their favorite trees, symbolically evoking a relationship to the park. And then I sort of blew those up into big shapes and we painted them on the sidewalk. And now people are going to come in and help finish that work tomorrow. The mayor's coming, Senator Hayes is coming, some of my neighbors are coming and a lot of kids. So that's the one that's most meaningful to me. And it's ongoing. It's going to take 20 years to change that street.
So is the art and design, the graphics and colors pretty much almost irrelevant? It's like, it's all about the community and just having the presence of art that makes it work. I mean, yeah, anybody can design and pick the colors. I mean, yeah, I understand that this can involve them, but at the end, it's like this could be painted by a 3-year-old kid. When you choose the right design and like the view from the top and the right lanes, and anything can be filled.
Yes.
But
so there's a couple things. One is when I'm working in the street here where there's cars, I work with my crew of professional muralists. Just because of risk, right?
Yeah, but it's like
we always design something on the sidewalk, so that's where the community can help to contribute, and that's just to help mitigate risk. But I hear what you're saying, and yes, to that effect. I don't want to say that the colors don't matter because they do matter, right? In this sense, they represent the sunset, and in other places, they might represent local symbols of pride and what have you. But I think what you're getting at, which is I certainly agree, is really it's about the process. Yeah. And for me as an artist, I'm trying to design a process that is elegant, not only in its visual look in the end, something that's going to look really cool and be cost effective and last as long as possible for that whatever modest budget we have, but also that has a process that is equally as elegant, if not more elegant, in terms of creating opportunities for people to share ideas, for people to learn skills, and for economic development. And so that's one of the things that I really pride myself on is oftentimes organizations will contact us, my company, and say like, hey, we saw something you did, we want to do something like that in our neighborhood. How much does that cost? So I'll meet with them, develop a cost estimate, and then they go out and they'll write a grant. And I'll say, you can take my cost estimate and literally copy and paste some of this stuff into your grant. It's writing some of the grant for them. They'll get them, and if they get the money, then we can come back and work together, right? But in my cost estimates, and so this is different than like, Walmart versus Target or whatever. Like, I'm not necessarily competing with other artists. And so for me, I mean, maybe sometimes I am, and that's fine. There's plenty of work to go around. But for me, in my budgets, I always make sure that people are going to get paid prevailing wages. And so I don't always actually count on volunteers. I do create volunteer opportunities so that anybody who wants to participate can. But especially in working in these historically disinvested areas, I'm looking for ways to bring in money to pay teens, to pay adults prevailing wages. So that's usually something like starting at $25 an hour. And so that it's not just like, oh, we got to make this cool project, but it's also putting some of that money back out into the community.
I had a question.
Yes.
Part of the reason it inspired me to invite friends is I moved to a neighborhood over the summer, and there's a street that's
fast-moving cars that go through stop signs. I'm just sometimes wonder, is it Baltimore that has this issue of people driving, over the speed limit, and is this a kind of problem that inspired you? This with the car culture.
I think the car culture is American. It's all over the place, but it shifts around. One of the things I find most fascinating is seeing how car culture varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. There are some intersections where it's just common practice that the car driver will yield to the pedestrian, and I've experienced these in Baltimore City, and it's confusing because I'm so used to assuming that nobody's seeing us and you don't want to get hit. But there's obviously most of the time, it is the case that you can't make any presumption that you have the right of way. But for example, the intersection that I most greatly admire and fascinated by is Lexington and Utah Street, which is right in front of the historic Lexington Market. If you're driving down that, it's just, that at any point, at any moment, someone might walk right in front of you. And so people drive very carefully, right? And that's a crazy intersection, but that's because the pedestrian intensity overpowers the cars. And that's what I love about it. And that's something that I hope that we get to preserve with the new Lexington Market. But I grew up in Tampa, and Tampa has historically had the second highest pedestrian fatality rate in the country. Florida in general has always in the top 10, has 5 cities in the top 10 of the most dangerous for pedestrians, because Florida's car culture is really intense. It's also a very suburban environment. And so, yeah, I mean, that's something I grew up with. And I was, I was privileged enough to be able to drive a car in high school when I turned 16, and I would drive around in my mom's old minivan and pick up all my friends on the way to school, and so, but one of the things I've seen since going back to Tampa that I think is a glimmer of hope is they have these, they're known as hawk signals, which are where you press a button as a pedestrian and it literally just, all the lights turn red and it stops all the cars. It's like parting the seas, and then you can walk across, and they've installed many of them along major highways. And I never would have expected that Tampa would be spending that kind of money to create protected crosswalks for people, and they're doing it, and it's working, and that's a good sign. Yeah. Baltimore is also doing it too. So to its credit, Baltimore in 2018 passed, thanks to the co-sponsorship of 3rd District Councilman Ryan Dorsey and former Councilman and now Mayor Brandon Scott, the Complete Streets Law, which is a bit of very important legislation that requires that going forward, the city always, when it's reconstructing streets or doing maintenance, balance out the needs of everyone. So it's not just making it exclusively for the benefit of cars driving fast and safe, but also for people on foot, wheelchair, bicycle, bus, you name it. And so now we're getting to see that law starting to be enforced as streetscape projects arise. Streets are being transformed, and that's really good. And we are one of the, I think, handful of big cities in the United States that have passed this type of really robust legislation. However, we have to sometimes remind City Hall to follow the laws. And so sometimes they kind of forget, and it's good to have advocates there on the sidelines cheering them on to follow the people's wishes.
Thank you so much, Graham. It's been wonderful. Feel free to take a lunch to go. We have some left over.
Thank you all.